So the books are on the table, the mics are in the hand. Over to you, Pushkar.
Thank you. I think after today morning, this is the first panel which actually again centers around two books. And I was told to be the discussion for these two books. You can see what the size is like. The physical exercise wasn't as intense as the mental exercise in handling these books. And I'm glad that, in a sense, to use a very bad pun, we've bookended today's sessions with a pair of books and a pair of books again. Uh, I'm delighted to have both these authors on this panel because they've worked on biographies of two people who are known to everyone. Everybody has heard of Swami Vivekananda. Everybody has also heard of Lala Lajpat Rai. And we know both these historical figures essentially through singular episodes that we have been taught and that we remember. When you say Vivekananda, everybody knows that he went to the Conference of Religions in Chicago and started a speech by saying, "Dear brothers and sisters," and everybody burst into applause. And that applause, depending on who tells the story, went on for minutes, hours, whatever it may be. And similarly with Lala Lajpat Rai, we know of a certain kind of martyrdom where he was protesting British rule non-violently and suffered a lathi charge and did not do very well and succumb to his injuries. And it's really unfortunate that both these historical personalities have been reduced to these singular events. Because once you read these books, you realize they are a lot more complex. And like all humans, there are self-contradictions at times. People also change through time. People have different views at different ages. People also have different views, or at least express them very differently in front of different audiences, and so on. And I think it's important, like both of them have said in their books, to re-examine historical figures time and time again, because looking at primary sources, looking at the histories of important people, reveals a lot more about our own times and our own anxieties as much as it does about the past. So when somebody in the 1950s writes about Swami Vivekananda, it's in a very different vein than somebody in the 70s, 90s, and perhaps even today. And given that 100 years more or less separates us from these two figures, it's important that we look at them at this time. And so, really, they've been appropriated by all kinds of schools. People have appropriated them as anti-imperialists, anti-colonialists, then as nationalists. They've been appropriated by the Marxists at one point, claiming them to be completely secular. They've also been thought of as champions of new Hindutva. And we really do not understand where these personalities lie unless we read them in their totality and in all kinds of contexts, understanding the context in which they behaved, they acted, and they also said and wrote things. And therefore, I probably would want to start off by saying, how would you say a history of both Lala Lajpat Rai and Swami Vivekananda are pertinent for these times? There must be some anxiety of the present by which they become relevant for us today.
Yeah, so I think Lajpat Rai initially was kind of examined as part of this history of anti-colonial nationalism. That's why in our textbooks, often he's part of the, Lal Bal Pal, everybody remembers him as part of that trio. And, juxtaposed to the moderates like Gokhale, so the extremists were people who advocated more radical methods to oppose anti-colonial nationalism. So that was the initial story about Lala Lajpat Rai that most of us have heard in our school textbooks. And then we've seen the Bhagat Singh movies. Mr. Anjum was here today, and there he's associated with Bhagat Singh, who avenges his death and is hanged for that act. So he's kind of associated, he's a kind of preface to the story of Bhagat Singh, actually, often. But then in the 90s, with the rise of the Hindutva and Hindu nationalism in society and politics, you had historians going back and trying to understand this politics, and then Lajpat Rai kind of appears as another avatar, which is a precursor to Savarkar. So he kind of comes up as in the prehistory of Hindutva in a way. But he's also not examined. So the story that kind of comes up is that he's somewhat like Savarkar. He was in the Hindu Sabha movement, the Hindu Mahasabha in the 1920s. So he's laying the groundwork for something that came later, and which is actually the focus of this historiography, Hindutva, the birth of Hindutva. And then I think since then, people have just kind of looked at Lajpat Rai just like that, in that mode of, someone who laid the ground for Hindutva. And interestingly, what has happened is that this is, politicians on the right have appropriated Lajpat Rai as a proponent of Hindutva. But at the same time, secular historians or professional historians have also affirmed this, they've agreed with this. So on both sides, there's this kind of strange agreement that Lajpat Rai fits into this history. And I was also, as a student, I read this history and thought I wanted to understand this kind of, tussle between Hindu nationalism on one hand and Hindutva on one hand. So I also actually went to Lajpat Rai to understand another figure like Savarkar. But what I found was that he was supporting the Khilafat movement. So how is a forefather of Hindutva supporting a movement in support of an Islamic caliphate? Obviously, there is something that we missed out. And what does that mean? What implication does that have on our understanding of Hindu nationalism and nationalism in general? And I wanted to show then this, unpack the reasoning and the differences in even two Hindu nationalists, what the intricate differences are, and why that is important is also, I think, why should one do this is because I think if you slot people into one category, and if you're seeing everyone as Hindutva or Savarkarite Hindutva, then you're kind of missing out that nuance. And even if you want to persuade people, you can't, because you've not understood what their position is. And then it's kind of the conversation is happening at cross purposes. And just for the sake of also democratic dialogue and persuasion, I wanted to kind of do this project. And there was one more thought that has totally gone out of my mind. So maybe I should let Govind speak. Sorry, no, the other thing was just for political reasons also, right? Like opening up these intellectual positions for a more richer politics and to even show, right now the debate often is quite stunted in the public. More national, less national, or anti-national, hyper-national. But I wanted to use Lajpat Rai as an entry point to just open up the real question is not whether Gandhi was a nationalist and Savarkar was a loyalist. They're both different kinds of nationalism and they're different kinds of nationalism. So just to open up that debate so that people can see that, it's a choice. You can make that choice. And there are resources in history that you can kind of go back to clarify your own position on what kind of a nationalist do you want to be. Yeah, sorry.
Use this.
Thank you, Vanya. In the case of Vivekananda, I think, at least for me, this was driven by anxieties about Hindutva. And in that sense, it is a definitely political book. Though I examine his philosophy and his political ideology theoretically, but the first half of the book examines his relationship to Hindutva. And at that level, it is, I see it as a political intervention because I think the historian or the thinker also has an obligation to, when they're in a democracy, they have a political obligation. And right now, Hindutva, from what was once a fringe project, is now a hegemonic project, which is also backed by state power, and which I feel, and I'm quite worried, it poses an existential threat to a republic, to a democracy. And this threat functions at the cultural level also, which is why there is so much propaganda around history. And in a way, our democracy is being contested through history now. And part of this history is Vivekananda. The Hindutva project is a political project, but its basic legitimacy lies in its claim to be representing Hinduism. So in a sense, its existence is parasitic on Hinduism. And Vivekananda is a very important figure for Hindutva to claim, because Vivekananda is very important to the identity of modern Hindus for a number of reasons. One is that he carries tremendous, he stands as a bridge between modern Hinduism and a very ancient tradition. It's bewildering, there's no single text. Bewildering number of texts, practices, contradictions, and Vivekananda evolves a kind of philosophical framework in which one can talk about Hinduism as a single religion. Not a monolithic religion, but as a coherent category of Hinduism. So in that sense, intellectually, Vivekananda is very important to modern Hinduism, and the framework he evolves is used by all later spiritual gurus, including Aurobindo and many others. Other thing is, he's a point of pride for Hindus because of his intellectual capital of having supposedly conquered the Western world for Indian thought. And also, Vivekananda is important because Vivekananda answers modernity's challenge to religion for Hinduism. All religions has to go through this phase. For Christianity, of course, that phase was one of terrible conflict. But Vivekananda meets this challenge of modern skepticism based on science and need for reason for Hinduism. So Hindus are able to say, look, the core of our religion is immune from modern skepticism. So in this senses, so getting hold of Vivekananda gets them Hindutva a very direct purchase on Hinduism, the religion. And for the same reason, to reappropriate Vivekananda for as a progressive thinker is important, which doesn't mean that it's a propagandist book. I think Vivekananda is very clear, his texts are very clear. All one needs to do is make the effort to read him in his totality rather than picking up. He had a habit of contradicting himself. So he's an intellectual biographer's nightmare. He'll say one thing, you can be sure, it's a truism that if Vivekananda says one thing categorically in one place, he's sure to say the exact opposite somewhere else. So one has to make an effort to take the whole of his thought into account, his historical context into account. And that is where, as I think Vanya mentioned the case of Lajpat Rai, Vivekananda has been recently read in a very negative manner by liberal left academicians. This is a new trend because both nationalists and even leftist historians read him as a progressive. And he's been claimed from everything from being a socialist to, as a spiritual thinker, as anticipating Gandhi, everything. But the new critiques are certain postmodern critiques of identity, broadly speaking. It's a legitimate concerns, but the methodology they followed suffers from fatal flaws. And so these concerns are normative values for us, and it's important to look at Vivekananda through them. But I think the way it has been done has been very sloppy, historically anachronistic. So that's another reason to look at Vivekananda through those concerns of our times, but do it in a proper way.
I think both of you have stressed the importance of looking at people with their writings in totality and not just cherry picking things that are convenient, taking them out of context, and so on. Now, both of them, Swami Vivekananda and Lala Lajpat Rai, are operating in the context of missionary disparagement of Hinduism on one hand, and also a fierce anti-colonial movement on the other. And that does shape their views in many ways, which might be tempered when they're in completely different contexts. So when Vivekananda travels abroad, particularly in the United States, the focus changes, just as for Lala Lajpat Rai, things change when he is in different contexts in different parts of the country. Uh, Again, somebody who's associated with the Arya Samaj early on, then with the Congress, and then with the Hindu Mahasabha. Uh, there are different contexts for all of his writings. Would you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, that is also one similarity, which is the American context, because Lajpat Rai, till 1915, Lajpat Rai is kind of articulating this idea of a Hindu nation. And this is also why, so he gives one speech in 1909 where he articulates a very strong idea of the Hindu nation. And what binds the Hindus together, according to him, is Hindu culture. He kind of assimilates Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, all into this Hindu nation, which is bound together by Hindu culture and excludes Muslims and Christians. And this sounds very similar to Savarkar. I can go into the differences with Hindutva later, but by 1915, he's actually transformed, and he's gone to London, and then the First World War has broken out, and he gets stuck there, and he then actually crosses the ocean and goes to America, where he stays for the next 5 years. And there, maybe it's because of the changed geographical position, or he's kind of hanging around and kind of, interacting with a lot of progressive, socialist, liberal, progressive intellectuals. That milieu, a lot of them had inclusive, egalitarian ideas. W.E.B. Du Bois, he's hanging out with people like that. And then the First World War, that has a huge impact on him. And that makes him really imagine the world in a very different way. From a world where some nations are superior, morally, culturally superior, and have a right to kind of rule over and train these other inferior nations, to a world of equal self-governing nations. And he kind of makes this shift from using the term in so before 1915, he's using the term nation in two senses. So one is the pre-nationalist sense of the term nation, where the term nation is basically used like as a cultural community. It doesn't have connotations of statehood. This idea is there, and Lajpat Rai also uses it, this new nationalist sense of the term nation, where a nation is now not just a cultural community, but a cultural community that should be self-governing and self-ruling and should have a state of its own. In 1915, with the outbreak of the First World War, he really shifts very firmly to this modern, full-fledged nationalist conception of the nation, where the nation is a cultural community which must be self-governing and have a state of its own. And when he makes this shift, that's when he also shifts to using the term, he shifts his conception of nationhood to this, India being a land inhabited by Hindu and Muslim nations, to now, no, there's only one nation in India, and that's not a religiously defined nation. It's the Indian nation, which comprises different religious communities. And then he really shifts the way he imagines, this one political community, and he tries to grapple with this idea. So what then binds these Hindu and Muslim communities that he was earlier referring to as a nation? And he is kind of coming up with different ideas. So he's rethinking the concept of race and talking about, Hindus and Muslims have, common, they're a common racial admixture. So Muslims have a lot of Aryan blood in them, Hindus have a lot of Mongolian blood in them. We're all a racial mix. And then he's, coming up with these new ways of kind of, defining this new nationhood and talking about how India must have a pluralist public culture, which it kind of look up to Akbar and, combine the best elements of Hinduism and Islam. He's talking about celebrating both Hindu and Muslim festivals as national festivals. We're proud of, Ram Mohan Roy and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, all of that. And he's also going back and reinterpreting India's medieval history. So whereas earlier he had seen India's medieval history as one of antagonism between Hindus and Muslims, he's now kind of reimagining that and talking about, making these kinds of statements that, that Muslims may have, these rulers came from outside. So they may have been foreigners in origin, but ultimately they made India their land, they settled here, they made it their home, they married here, they had children there. and they're Indians by marriage, birth, marriage, and death, and really looks at also how the Mughal rulers didn't have this kind of social exclusivity and pride that the contemporary British rulers have. There was much more kind of contributions to Indian culture, like Urdu, which is purely Indian. That's how he defines it. And then also looking at Aurangzeb, like questioning this kind of colonial historiography that is portraying Aurangzeb as like massacring Hindus, and he's really challenging those colonial representations of medieval Indian history, and talking about like how also the highest political offices were open to Hindus under the medieval rulers, and then also comparing Europe's medieval times to Indian, so kind of contrasting the religious persecution and warfare that was happening in medieval Europe to the relative religious tolerance that was actually happening here. So you have this kind of sense of change and fluidity in Lajpat Rai, depending on the changed context and his engagement with that context, that is often missed out when you kind of club him into just one thing.
I was just going to remind everyone that the knowledge of history around the turn of the century between the 19th and the 20th is already very different from what we know of history. The Indus Valley civilization has not been discovered. A lot of breakthroughs in terms of reading older inscriptions have not been made. Many dynasties are unknown. And even words like race or Eurasian or Indo-European have completely different connotations and meanings. And so, of course, both these historical figures are working within the confines of historical knowledge as it stands then, and also vocabulary that is prevalent in that time. But again, Vivekananda is also very well read in European history and has a lot to say, being prescient about World War I as well. Which one is not working? No, just turn it off, the button.
Vivekananda's mastery of history was quite extraordinary. He was pretty well read in, he studied philosophy and law, and he was pretty well read in philosophy, but he seems to have an encyclopedic knowledge of European history, so much so that he impresses Harvard historians. And what I keep wondering about is where he had time to read this much, because he just seemed to like spend his time traveling around India, not like there were libraries at every corner. So, I mean, either he possessed a photographic memory, perhaps. But yeah, talking about going to, the change in going to the United States is that we have this picture of Vivekananda who goes to Chicago, delivers a message, and keeps preaching and coming back, and goes again. That's it. But in a sense, Vivekananda himself was made in the West, in the sense that his social philosophy, his understanding of the Western world and the future of civilization, of modernity, crystallizes when he comes into contact with Americans. And I don't know whether he changed any of his views, but they got a much more concrete form. But in one thing, his views on women, for example, just 6 months before he leaves, he is writing to a woman friend, advising her, that above all, the highest duty of a woman is to her husband, and you should keep that in mind in your troubles and all that. 6 months in the US, and he's become a kind of proto-feminist who is arguing that women should have, the idea of women's equality is perfect freedom, and that the biggest mistake we can make is tell women how to be free. All men can do is educate women, give them the means, and let them decide for themselves. He's also in favor of women's vote, which is a quite advanced position for that time for even European liberals, because many feminists were against women's vote for various reasons at that time. But overall, being in America, Vivekananda view of the West becomes very positive. Even about Britain, while he decries the oppression, political oppression, he thinks it is on the long run, uh, a blessing in the form of a curse, because it has connected India up with the world of ideas, and it is bringing modernity to India, which will eventually transform her institutions, including, he believed, caste. He believed that the contact with Western modernity would eventually make caste vanish. And he develops a tremendous admiration for the West. So this binary of a spiritual India, a spiritual Hinduism, and a materialist West that the conservative right-wing or Hindutva uses, you actually find such a binary in Vivekananda. But the difference is this, that materialism is not talking about culture. Like, he never claims that Hindu culture or Indian culture is in any sense superior or spiritual. By spirituality, he only means mysticism. And by materialism, he is not talking about conservative social codes or traditions or food or any of these things. He's talking about their technological progress, their development of social institutions that are free, their deployment of technology for material benefits, their accumulation of power. And that is where he revokes materialism, because he sees capitalism as greed run amok, and he sees their military aggressiveness something that will, he says that Europe will go to peace it's a volcano that's going to blow up. If you continue to pursue power at this competitive rate and militarize like this, in 50 years, European civilization will crumble to pieces. And he sees this around 50 years before the Second World War ends. So one thing that is never conveyed about Vivekananda is that what he was aspiring to was what he called a synthesis of the East and the West. He says this, he writes this in several articles and says that my project is to pick up what is best from India and from the West and combine them. And he thinks that most of all, India has to learn social freedom from the West. He writes to a disciple just after a year or two when he's in America, asking, can you make an European society in India with the Hindu religion? I believe it is possible and it should be done. And his thinking here is that in the West, he says spirituality has not grown because religion has been regulated by church or clerics. So, but he's not comparing the Abrahamic religions and Hinduism, because he claims, like a lot of Indian intellectuals did in the 19th century, that Christ was an Oriental. And of course, Islam has a very developed mystical tradition. So for him, the core of religion is mysticism. And he claims that because belief was regulated in the West, spirituality never grew. And in India, however, the shackles on the feet of society in every sense, caste, social regulations, rules, lack of personal freedom. And by setting society free, the West has developed. And this is something India should emulate. And when he says India should teach the world, his idea is not that India should, is called upon to go and proudly proclaim our religion, the spiritual wealth, like the Vishwaguru kind of thing. What he actually tells Indians during his speech is, will you always keep learning? Surely you too should have something to give to the world as a nation. And I think what you have is yours centuries long of spiritual wealth, which you can contribute. And eventually, he said that, the Westerners are going to become spiritual very soon, and they're going to overtake you. So he didn't consider that, for perpetuity, Hinduism was on a spiritually higher plane or something.
He also makes it clear that he does not believe spiritualism can be proven materially in any way. And he also says that the material history of the world should not be confused with mythology or religion. He very much is in favor of evidence-based authority for one kind of knowledge, and then another kind of experiential authority for another kind of knowledge. With Lala Lajpat Rai, there is an interesting dynamic, because he comes from Punjab, where as a Hindu, he is in a minority, and he therefore is a big champion of minority rights everywhere. Whereas when he identifies himself as an Indian, he then becomes part of the majority, and he takes it upon himself to safeguard rights of the minorities, even in a larger state where he's in a majority. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, so that was one thing that actually came up quite, it was very interesting because Lajpat Rai, maybe I can talk about his Hindu Mahasabha phase in the 1920s, and this kind of comes up there quite interestingly. So this is the context is that he's back from America, and he first participates in the Khilafat movement, and he's very enthusiastic about it. But by the end of it, the top leaders are kind of jailed. The movement is clamped down upon. Imperialism is very much back and is staying. And there are these cycle of Hindu-Muslim riots that start. There's competitive communalism happening, Shuddhi Sangathan, Tanzim, Tabligh. The Lucknow Pact, which had been agreed upon by Jinnah and Tilak in 1916, was breaking apart, and like people from different leaders from Punjab and Bengal were kind of asking for more. Hindus wanted to roll it back. Some Muslim leaders want to kind of ask for more. And in this context, also what has happened is that in the Northwest Frontier province, which is a Muslim majority province, neighboring the Muslim majority Punjab province, which is where Lajpat Rai is from, there's a riot that happens, the Kohat riot in 1924. And the British government evacuates the Hindu minority out of Kohat. And this really plays upon the minds of a lot of Punjabi Hindu leaders, like Bhai Parmanand, a lot of other people, but also Lajpat Rai. And this is when he actually turns to the Mahasabha. And in reaction to this violent atmosphere, and also in reaction to this, what he sees as a consolidation of the Muslim position, like a lot of different Muslim organizations are coming together. Actually, it was a kind of overestimation of how united they were. They were really not, and it was actually a moment where the Muslim League was taken the least seriously by the British because it was so fragmented, and different provincial leaders were coming up. Fazle Hussain in Punjab, is become a lot more influential. Lots of Bengali Muslim politicians are becoming influential, much more than the Muslim League. But Lajpat Rai sees this as some sort of a political consolidation, that the Muslims are coming together and asking for something in a united way above what was asked for at the Lucknow Pact. And so Hindus also need to kind of mirror this, and they also need to come up with a united position on what they think is, what the form of government should be in the future. How much representation should the communities have? So in this context, Lajpat Rai is, asking for Hindu Sangathan, Hindu political organization, and this is his Hindu Mahasabha politics, which is, this kind of politics of consolidation in order to oppose separate electorates which are demanded by Muslims, and also communal representation in excess of their numbers, which had been agreed, and an excess of the Lucknow Pact, which had been agreed upon. So a lot of it, the fury of his Hindu communal politics, which we see in the last 4 years of his life, from 1924 to 28, is actually about containing Muslim demands and opposing this kind of expansion of Muslim political rights. But what he is, and what people get confused by, is that this communal consolidation and this Hindu communal politics is actually not for a Hindutva nationalism. It's for a secular Indian nationalism. And what he's imagining is that he can kind of organize these Hindus currently, temporarily, to inaugurate a secular Indian nationalist state in the future, where there is, no Hindu theocracy, no privilege for Hindus, absolute, freedom of religion for everyone, equal citizenship, and separation of, religion from the state. It's kind of separated, so a radically secular state. Hindustani is the national language still, so he's still advocating that. He's not shifted to Hindi. And federalism, so in a country where there are still Muslim majority provinces, federalism where Muslims will have, substantial cultural autonomy. And sometimes, though, sometimes he's reluctant about it, and sometimes not, but he's willing to concede Muslim reservations in proportion to their population in the country. not above that. But he's willing to. So there's some sort of an acknowledgement of fears, of Muslim fears or minority fears of Hindu majority domination at the center. And my interpretation was that it's his position as a minority, as a Hindu minority in Punjab, that he can kind of empathize with these fears that the Muslim minority has. But at the same time, the opposite also happens, which is that his fears as a Hindu minority in Punjab, the fears of Muslim domination, also get transposed to the all India level. And so this fear of the Muslim domination is really a fear of a Hindu minority figure in Punjab, kind of transposing this onto the all India plane where it doesn't make sense. And it's linking back to other fears about Mughal rule and all of that. It's getting linked up in this violent atmosphere in the 1920s. But yeah, this Hindu minority position was interesting because he is both empathizing with the minority, Muslim minority because of his position, but also the fears are also kind of getting transferred onto this other level where they actually don't make sense. In a future democratic India, Hindus will be the majority, and there's no reason to fear a minority in a democratic context. Yeah.
And without any kind of fear, Swami Vivekananda also envisages a nation which is broadly along similar lines, where you have freedom of religion, freedom of expression.
The thing is, Vivekananda strangely did not comment on politics. So, like, there's a kind of rule, and something that the Sri Ramakrishna mission still keeps. If you're a monk, you cannot make political statements. In fact, Sister Nivedita, who got actively involved in nationalist politics, right? She supported Aurobindo Ghosh and Varinder Ghosh and supplied them with information, which is kind of dangerous thing to do. So she had to dissociate with the Ramakrishna mission to do that. So Vivekananda doesn't make direct political statements of the nature of an Indian state. In fact, he doesn't, even he has an ambivalent stance even towards the Congress. In a sense, he has the kind of anxiety Ambedkar had, that if you try to get political power before social reformation happens, the power will pass to the elite. So he's afraid that India, if it at that moment tries to form an independent country or political unit, even perhaps Dominion status, because I don't think anyone was demanding independence then, he's afraid that it would lead to an upper caste, a government that is I don't know what's the word for a government dominated by upper caste, but but in terms of a national nation imagined as a cultural entity, which was what was happening in the late 19th century, Vivekananda's idea is that Muslims are equally part of the imagined Indian nation. And though he doesn't talk in terms of rights, and because that's all much more in the future, right? The Swadeshi, I mean, nationalism proper doesn't start till the Swadeshi movement in 1905. But the most important thing is two things. One is approach to Islam. And I think Lajpat Rai's father was very influenced by Islam, but he moved away from that, right? So the same thing, in Vivekananda's parentage, his father was very immersed in both in Islamic culture and New Persian. And Vivekananda's he studies the Quran in a kind of syncretic religious culture that you had, where spiritual masters from both religion were recognized. He even, you see him at places discoursing with Muslims on the Quran. In fact, when he came to Mysore, and he stays at the court of the Raja, there's a state councillor who approaches Vivekananda with doubts on the Quran, which he clears for him. And he has a lot of positive things to say about Islam, when he had criticisms also, but he had criticisms of all religions. But it is noteworthy that he criticized his own religion the most, an insider's criticism. So you will find some negative comments about Islam, but by and large, he singled out for praise on the front that Islam is the most egalitarian of all religions. So he says, and we find him defending Islam in the West against the kind of Islamophobic stereotypes that the polygamy, that it is a polygamous religion. And to that he gives a classic liberal response, which is that Islam was, restricting the number of wives to 4, while the women's condition there was worse because the number of wives were permitted in Arabian culture was much more, and he gives financial rights to women and so forth and so on. And he was, most importantly, the history of Islamic conquest. For Hindutva, Indian civilization collapses or goes into decline because of foreign conquest. There's British dominion, which is equivalent to Christian dominion for them, and much more the Islamic conquest. Now, Vivekananda says that yes, there was violence in the beginning, there might have been forced conversions, but once Islamic rule starts, he saw Islamic rulers as ruling as Indians. And especially the Mughals, he had a kind of pet fascination with the Mughals. He massively admired Islamic architecture, painting, and Shah Jahan, and in terms of, and Akbar was kind of he thought that Akbar and Ashoka were the two greatest emperors, rulers India had. He went so far as to say that Akbar was probably someone who was on almost at the stage of enlightenment, but missed the step and was born as a king. He had that high an opinion of Akbar. One of a Western disciple of Vivekananda says that it's as if the Mughals has cast some kind of spell on Swamiji. He's that besotted with them. And he says that the fall of Indian civilization, and he says this to huge Indian audiences, mainly composed of upper caste Hindus, that you can't blame anyone but yourself. Do not blame the British, not blame the Muslims. India fell because of how our upper caste ancestors treaded on the lower caste. He calls them the masses because caste wasn't really a category of analysis then, but it's very clear that he means the lower caste. They oppressed them in terms of caste restrictions, feudal power, reducing them to poverty, giving them no education. And this he considered the reason for India's downfall. And so in that sense, whenever that whole grievance of an Islamic conquest is completely absent from his understanding of history, and then it obviously plays no part in his conception of Indian nationality.
But this apprehension of elites, whether it's caste-based elites or class-based elites, taking over the nation, is something that is shared very much by Lajpat Rai as well when he questions Sir. Sorry.
When? Sorry, what do you mean?
In the beginning of the book, I think I remember a passage where he's worried about a certain kind of elite rule taking over.
Oh, yes, yeah, you're right. That's his debate with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So, yeah, the aristocratic kind of, the Lajpat Rai and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, that interaction, although it's a one-way interaction for most part, is this kind of, the kind of collapse of this old aristocratic world, which is arguing for, like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is arguing for, a representation on the basis of social pedigree and,
nominated elites.
Nominated representation, and then this new kind of Congress and Lajpat Rai making this argument for the Congress, which is, this new middle class, still an elite, but a different kind of an elite, not an aristocratic elite, but a middle class elite, which is also now claiming to kind of represent the voice of the people, which Sir Syed, of course, thinks that he can just do without.
In fact, there are very interesting passages in this whole thing where Sir Syed Ahmad Khan equates all these new bourgeoisie with Bengalis, saying, how can you get all these Bengali bureaucrats who've never known what it is to rule over old aristocratic families?
Yes. It's quite, he kind of follows the colonial stereotype of the Bengalis as well, as effeminized.
And what I found most fascinating with both books is all these kinds of little nuggets that don't fit in with personalities as we've studied them in school or seen popular images. For example, Swami Vivekananda smoking is so well attested to. He's a big fan of smoking, and in the United States, he takes a particular like to cigars, and not just takes a like, but loves them so much that he insists on smoking where there are no smoking signs. Maybe you can. Uh,
Yeah, so interestingly, there was more moral taboo against smoking in the West, basically the Victorian West, than compared to India. I think maybe because the hookah was always a cultural um, part of the culture, right? Especially, it was considered impolite to smoke if ladies were present. Um, so Vivekananda thought this was kind of patronizing, and he would smoke in front of the ladies. And as one of his, someone who later would become his disciple, said, I was so irritated with this man. He'll come and put ashes all over the house and blow smoke in my face. If it was any other gentleman, I would have just kicked him out of the house. And there is an account from a gentleman who knew him when he was preaching in New York. Apparently, Vivekananda, him and a lady were on the ferry, crossing, and they're on the upper deck. The ladies all sat on the upper deck, so you can't smoke there. But Vivekananda lights up, and the lady beside him is very anxious and says, Swami, you can't do that here. And he's like, why not? And continues to smoke. Soon the policeman who's patrolling on lower deck comes up, and he sees Vivekananda smoking. And Vivekananda continues to puff. And he waits till the policeman walks up to him, then he smiles, laughs, and just throws a cigarette outside. The thing is that he had no reverence. He was very irreverent, and he was iconoclastic. And of course, nowadays it's very difficult to imagine someone from the religious realm, being an iconoclast. Though originally the word did come from religion, but in the sense that we use it now. But there were no holy cows for him, like literally, like even with the cows, he used to provoke Hindus by talking about how no Brahmin could remain a Brahmin in Vedic times without eating beef. And when he went to Travancore, which is the southern, this present-day Kerala, the southern state of princely kingdom, some notables, he met all the local notables, some Brahmins gathered together, and they asked him, Swamiji, which do you think is the most glorious period of our religion? And without blinking, he says, the Vedic age, of course, when 5 Brahmins could sit together and polish off an entire cow. So this kind of thing is always there. And the other thing that is about Vivekananda is his criticism of Brahmins. He was almost vituperative at times in his condemnation of Brahmin orthodoxy as responsible for, casteism, keeping religious knowledge in their hands, denying education to the masses. There is a historian who comments that, if any secular figure had made these statements at that time, I don't think the Hindus would have met him with violence. But because they revered this man as a spiritual figure, he could get away with saying such things. In fact, I think some points, I don't think Ambedkar was always polite. Vivekananda's anger could boil over into not abuse, but such scathing put downs that, it's quite interesting to read.
Any anecdotes about
Lala ji.
which
I don't know if he smoked.
which you particularly enjoyed?
I mean, mine was a history of ideas, so I really did focus on the political ideas and the nationalist, his ideas evolving through time. So I didn't really go into these, nuggets of what he was eating and what he was smoking and drinking. But otherwise, I mean, I could just elaborate on the differences with Savarkar, which was a question we were discussing earlier also. But so yeah, why he sounds similar is what I was saying. This articulation of a idea of a Hindu nation, of which Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains are also a part, and is the core of that nation is the Hindu culture. So you can have a different religion, but the commonalities in culture. So culture is kind of prioritized over religion, and that is the way all this diversity within Hinduism and with Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains can be, accommodated into the Hindu nation, but not Muslims and Christians. So that is the similarity between the speech that Lajpat Rai makes in 1909, which is why he's often interpreted as a pioneer of Hindu nationalism and laying the groundwork for later Hindutva nationalism, which is articulated by Savarkar in 1923, like 12, 13 years later. But the difference is that Lajpat Rai is imagining a Hindu nation and a Muslim nation within, so they can have a frictious kind of relationship, but also a politically cooperative relationship. And he imagines them both as robustly coexisting together in this common state. Unlike Savarkar, who has this, like 3 essentials of Hindutva. One is that you, are born in Hindustan, you love it as as your fatherland. Second is you possess Hindu blood. But these two he saw as, Muslims and Christians actually meet these 2 essentials of Hindutva. So they are born in India, they can love it, and they also possess, in his idea, they possess Hindu blood because they were Aryans who just converted to a different religion. But despite this, according to Savarkar, they couldn't be part of the nation of India, the Hindutva nation, because they disowned Hindu culture, which is the essential, culture of India. They disowned Hindu Sanskriti and adopted a foreign religion and a foreign culture. Lajpat Rai never has this, and the only way in which, for Savarkar, they can become part of the Hindutva nation, which is the only nation in India, is to renounce their religion and give up their foreign culture and adopt Hindu culture, worship and revere Hindu culture. Otherwise, you just exist here as second-class citizens. And Lajpat Rai never, ever articulates, in all his fluidity and change, no matter how robust his Hindu nationalism becomes, he's never actually demanding this kind of assimilation from other people. He doesn't have this fantasy of a Hindu cultural supremacy, Hindu cultural domination. He doesn't have this aversion to something which he sees as radically different religiosity. And he's, like, for him, diversity, religious and cultural diversity is just a given in India. So, yeah, that is why.
Just again with the Savar Hindutva, this. Vivekananda is particularly thought as toxic to Hindutva because the Hindu Sanskriti that Savarkar demands. And it appears in various iterations in Hindutva thinkers. For Golwalkar, it's Sanskriti. For Deen Dayal Upadhyay, it's Bharatiya culture. But basically, it is all this, it's a matrix of Hindu cultural elements, right? Because I remember Savarkar defines Sanskriti as the collection of Hindu festivals, rituals, pilgrimages, and all these things. And same kind of things for Golwalkar also. So it's a matrix of religious, cultural signifiers which are to be performed, and they want to conserve it, and they want to form an Hindu identity around that. To be a Hindu means to perform them, and in a sense also to freeze them in time. But Vivekananda was known in his own time as a universalist. I mean, what he was famous for in the West was advocating that you need a universal religion, and that in a sense the world is progressing towards one. So in his theory of religion itself was that there is an essential part of religion and a non-essential part. And the essential part was what he considered the spiritual truth. And he would compare it to a jewel within a casket. And the casket is basically the various forms that religions use to express the truth through mythology, sacred symbols, pilgrimages, all these things. And these are, he says, the abstract principle, which is very difficult to imagine. Like, what do you imagine, say, a God that is transcendent above space-time? What is that? You can't imagine it. So you use concrete symbols to bring that idea to your mind. So that is maybe operational and an aid that can be thrown away. So he calls it the non-essential part of religion, and he warns that the greatest degeneration that can happen is if you confuse religion with these externalities. That going to church become basically being a Christian, going to a temple, putting a, something on a mark on your forehead means being Hindu. So Vivekananda actually says to an audience in America that the Hindu religion is as much your property as it is mine. And he also says in one speech that my guru used to say that these words like Hindu, Christian, Islam, Muslim, all are Mohammedan and all are, they have become just poisonous words under whose baneful influence the best of us act as demons. All their good powers are gone, and we should try to break them down. So his idea was that the world would eventually move as, and there is still the Enlightenment idea of the world moving towards greater rationality, that the religious identity would get more and more diluted. So for him, being Hindu meant that everything that the Sangh Parivar has latched on to as being Hindu is something he considers completely non-essential, peripheral. And to be a good Hindu, or, I mean, there's nothing like a good Hindu, but what he says is there is only one duty that Hinduism lays upon a believer, is that try and realize the permanent amidst the evanescent. And there's no one way you can do it. Good, evil, knowledge, ignorance, anything. So if that is a duty, then everything that the Sangh has latched on to is a non-essential. And it is also the ethnic cultural matrix that they need to keep Hindu consolidation alive. For Vivekananda, to be spiritual means negating even your own religious identity, especially if you are a Hindu, because he considered this an explicit message of Hinduism.
Just before we open up for questions, one last question, which is a kind of meta take on the book, stepping outside the contents of the book. What during the research of this, I mean, you took 5 years, you took a long time to, during the research for this book, where did the most unexpected information come from? You know, you always hear stories of somebody you bumped into who happened to be a great-grandson of the person you were studying, or you stumbled upon some kind of box where you found records that nobody had seen for 100 years. Did you have any of those wonderful, magical moments?
Well, mine happened very soon. So it was 15 volumes of Lala Lajpat Rai's collected works that I was going through, and viewing him as this kind of proto-Savarkar, proto-Hindu nationalist figure. And then I looked at volume, it was 8 or 9 or something. I kind of just randomly picked it up, and this is Lala Lajpat Rai, forefather of Hindutva, supporting the Khilafat movement. And then I read a little bit more, and he's supporting the Lucknow Pact. He's reinterpreting Muslim, this medieval history. So for me, these were very very different from what my imagination of Lajpat Rai was. So for me, that was the aha moment, which kind of motivated me throughout, and also just how much fluidity there was in this thinker over time. So kind of just following his thought over time and how it's changing and trying to make a sense of it, and very deliberately trying to not iron it out, which could be the temptation, just to relieve yourself of the hard work of kind of making sense of different, like changing fluid positions. But also sometimes he is also a relatively unsystematic thinker. So I kind of refer to him as a politician thinker, because he's not that theorist. He's not a Tagore, he's not a Gandhi even. He's very much embedded in the thick of politics, responding to different people, different events, and therefore there are these shifts or sometimes inconsistencies. But you don't want to reduce him also to some incoherent, fickle person who doesn't know his mind. There is some intellectual coherence. There are some parameters. He never becomes a Gadarite. He never becomes a Savarkar. So there is some integrity to his thought, but still there are these fluidities and inconsistencies that you have to grapple with and make sense of. And then that became the challenge. And then I think that's valuable, because I think scholars often end up boxing people according to their own concepts and categories, and then you are not actually recognizing people who maybe actually, they're not ideological people. They are people who are making sense of things, and they can put A, B, C together with G, X, Z. And that may not fit the ideological framework, but that is what is existing. So we have to also maybe understand that, and maybe that is why the world is maybe undergoing this upheaval right now. Maybe we need to come up with a new vocabulary to understand what is going on also.
There was no aha moment for me, but I did come across some interesting links with unexpected people. Like, for example, there's someone called Lucy Munro, who started Poetry magazine. It's the most prestigious poetry magazine in the world. And it has this, I studied English literature. So we were taught modernist poetry by this very legendary teacher, he's retired now, Professor Rajiv C. Krishnan. And so the creation of modernist English poetry, right? T.S. Eliot, Pound, and all that. So this Lucy Munro plays an important part, and she's been kind of written out of the history of modernism because she starts this magazine, which becomes one of the few spaces that would take this very experimental verse. So Pound is actively collaborating with her, and he publishes in it. One of Eliot's earliest poems is published in poetry. I think it was a proof rock. And Lucy Munro happens to have witnessed Vivekananda, and she wrote a review of the Parliament of Religions and of Vivekananda, a portrait of Vivekananda, which for a cultural magazine. And he's the one who came up with this phrase, which is often used with Vivekananda that time, an orator by divine right. And there's this kind of curious connections. There's this theory that everyone in the world is connected by 5 people, right? So I realized that Vivekananda is connected to Hegel by two people, which was like quite fascinating for me.
Okay, we'll open up for questions if anybody has any. Go ahead, John. Oh, or just come up.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. That was fascinating. So I'm just curious about what both figures, thought about ethnology and anthropology. Now this, because at the same time you're thinking, you have the golden bough out, right? You've got notions of, we've got Durkheim and Mauss, structuralism and the like. So if you're looking at say, the Mongoloid and the Caucasioid or the Negroid, how are they dealing with this? I'm particularly interested seeing that you mentioned, for example, that he was that there were conversations with W.B. Du Bois, right? And so and he's writing the Souls of Black Folk at this point in time. What were the points of conversation? Was there any influence when they came back in terms of thinking anthropologically? And one point to you, sir, is we know that Vivekananda went and meditated on the rock down in Cape Comorin. Was there any comment to the same Brahmins about what would take 40 years for the Temple Proclamation Act to come into being in Kerala, in Travancore, Cochin? Did he not speak about this when he went to Travancore?
So your first question, I think, was, yeah, so the interaction with what he takes away really is he's comparing intercaste relations with white-black relations in America. That's the comparison he's really making. So race, yeah, so in America it's the race and in India caste. That's the equation and comparison he makes. I think I'll have to go a lot more, or someone else actually, because I will move away from Lajpat Rai now, but someone else has to kind of go and, I think, look deeper at those interactions and what exactly the points of influence are and what are not, because that milieu is also quite diverse. There are people who hold quite racist views, and there are people who hold very inclusive, egalitarian views. And the other question, so while in America, he's actually, when he's articulating this new Indian nationalism that he's kind of turned towards, he's very dismissive of this race, the concept of purity, racial purity or separate races. He's really talking about where the sons of man have mingled so freely that all these things are just ethnological pretensions, and these are he's very dismissive, and talking about people as like really being a racial admixture. Yeah.
So Vivekananda, when he does go to Kanyakumari after visiting Kerala, and what he says then is that um, Malabar is um, a lunatic asylum because of the kind of caste system that exists there, because they have come up with innovative theories of how untouchability can spread through air. But he actually, for the Irava movement doesn't get going for almost a decade after Vivekananda's visit there. But he has a very direct connection to the Irava movement. And that happens, interestingly, in Mysore, not when he visits Kanyakumari. Because when he comes to Mysore, he meets, so the Irava movement is, there's almost the three great figures are, of course, Narayana Guru. Then there is Kumaran Ashan, who was the pioneer of romantic poetry in Malayalam. And there is Dr. Padmanabhan Palpu. Palpu was a medical doctor, medical doctor. He got a trained degree from Travancore, but he was not given state employment because he was an Irava. So he came and worked in the service of the Mysore state. And when Vivekananda comes here, he meets him and talks about the problems that they face. And interestingly, he tells him, you can't expect any help from the upper caste in Travancore. Try to get hold of a sannyasi from your caste and launch a movement. And so Palpu seems to have become at least open to the idea of Hindu reformation. And 4 years later, to what extent Vivekananda's advice stayed in his mind, we don't know, but he does meet Narayana Guru and launches the SNDP with him as the head. But Vivekananda's thought definitely influenced the Irava movement quite a bit, because Kumaran Ashan was, in fact, their flagship magazine was named Vivekodayam in tribute to Vivekananda. And Kumaran Ashan translates his works into Malayalam. And there is there is a historian called Jeffrey Robbins, who is of sociology of Kerala, and he writes that one can detect after Narayana Guru, one can detect the thought of Vivekananda very much in the Irava movement. But all this happens like around 14 years before the Temple entry, not in 40s, sorry, Temple entry is in 1940s. So it's much before that, but the formative years, he seems to have played an influence on the Irava movement.
So, in both the cases, you must have read hordes of things that they have written. Does the term Sanatan figure in a lot? And if yes, with what connotations?
So Lajpat Rai is an Arya Samaji. So for him, Sanatani Hindus are a very important kind of interlocutor and a kind of Hindu to kind of oppose and reform. So idol worship is a big no-no for Arya Samajis like Lajpat Rai. So is all this. What he associates, Sanatani Hinduism as linked to this. To Brahmanism, which the Arya Samaj is also opposed to, this kind of priestcraft and, intermediary between an individual and God that, is opposed by the Arya Samajis, and a lot of these ceremonies and, excessive ritualism, all of that. So, and also polytheism. So that is the other thing, which Arya Samajis are, monotheistic. There's just one God and there's one text, the Vedas. Whereas Sanatanis have another way of doing things, which is according to Dayanand Saraswati and all Arya Samajis after him, including Lajpat Rai, that everything else that comes after the Vedas, which contains this abstract monotheistic worship towards one God, is a corruption of Hinduism. I mean, this is their
So
interpretation.
I knew that he's an Arya Samaji,
Yeah,
and but has he written it so explicitly in various writings, or it is there in a few
It kind of
documents?
it comes up very explicitly in all his writings on religion, especially in the earlier period. So 1880s, 1890s is when Sanatanis are the kind of main kind of opposition. But eventually he kind of moves to a much more Catholic kind of Hinduism, where he kind of realizes that if you insist too much on this kind of persnickety kind of, do this, don't do this, Hinduism is like this and not like this, then you're kind of losing out on a lot of Hinduism a lot of Hindus who do things in a different way. So he kind of accepts the position of the Arya Samaj as a sect, which is part of a broader entity called Hinduism, and then accepts Sanatanis as part of that. And in the Hindu Mahasabha phase, there's this slight tension that also comes in, because there is a felt need to organize and then to kind of collaborate with the Sanatanis in this forum. But then there's some tensions also, because he gets very frustrated by their position on caste also. Yeah.
I don't think Vivekananda, I mean, I don't know whether he mentions the term in some place, but it's definitely not part of his thought. He never uses it in any. Though I think the word Sanatana Dharma might have different meanings in different registers. There is this idea of Hinduism as eternal religion, which is a different idea of Sanatan than what is talked about these days, right? So Ramakrishna once mentions Sanatan Dharma, and perhaps in that sense Vivekananda might have used it, but it did not play any role in his thought. In fact, he even advised the Hindus to stop calling themselves Hindus, because he said the word has lost its meaning. It was merely a designation for people who lived across the Indus. So that is directly in contact to Savarkar, who says the word was so old that it just even predates the Sindhu. Like even though it's not used in the Vedas, he claims that it always existed. He says Hindus should call themselves Vedantas, because all philosophical schools that survive give their allegiance to Hinduism. So we can say he's not looking at Tantra, but Tantra is already in decline at that point. And Tantra was anyways a very under subterranean kind of thing, except in Bengal. So yeah, that's his turn.
That's actually very interesting that he wants to shift to a different category, because Lajpat Rai doesn't. He opposes the Gurukul party of the Arya Samajis who want to shift to this Vedic religion, but Lajpat Rai wants to, and the college party wants this larger entity called Hinduism.
But
I was just wondering whether any of the early nationalist leaders like Nehru were influenced by either of them. And of course, Vivekananda seems to have died in 1902, so Nehru was too small. But Lajpat Rai was there till 1928, I think. And also, did either of them have any economic vision? Because all that we are hearing is about their, issues with regard to, caste, communities, and so on and so forth. Did they ever have either of them have an economic vision of what to do with the nation?
That's a really interesting question. Both those questions, actually. Nehru was not, I think, influenced by Vivekananda, but he does give a speech at the Ramakrishna Mission once, which they publish now, where he says that a lot of people from his generation were influenced by Vivekananda, that people from his generation who joined the national movement, and that Vivekananda can be characterized as one of the founding fathers of the modern Indian national movement. He did influence a spectrum of nationalists, from left-wing revolutionaries to Hindu conservatives to people like Subhash Bose. Bose, interestingly, studied in the same college as Vivekananda, the Scottish Church College, which in Vivekananda's time was called General Assembly. And so he so admired Vivekananda. I don't know whether it was his alumni, but he says Vivekananda opened him to, inspired him to join the freedom movement, and that he says if Vivekananda was alive today, he would have been my guru. And most interestingly, he says that the doctrine of the equality of unity of religions, which is the Vivekananda Ramakrishna gospel, is what makes the freedom movement possible, because without that idea, we can't have an India that is only for Hindus or Muslims or Christians. So this is a basis on which we can conduct the freedom struggle.
Yeah, should I answer that question? There's a very interesting photo of the young Nehru with Lala Lajpat Rai in 1909 in Cambridge when Nehru was studying there, and Lajpat Rai goes and gives apparently a very fiery speech. And Nehru, this young Nehru, is very impressed with this extremist nationalist who is more radical than his father. So that's one influence, I guess, or like one anecdotal story. And then there's, I think in his autobiography, Nehru does mention that, I think because Nehru and Lajpat Rai had both been part of this Gandhi-led Khilafat movement, and Nehru had seen this American influence side of Lajpat Rai, progressive, that side, and the Khilafat movement, that participation together. And then he's quite shocked in the 1920s when Lajpat Rai turns to the Hindu Mahasabha. So I think in his autobiography, he mentions this kind of, like, it was very, like Malviya, we kind of knew that he was on that side a little bit, but we were shocked by Lajpat Rai. So he kind of makes that statement, I think, if I remember correctly. About the economic vision, I'm very bad at economics, so I didn't go there. But I know that in the Swadeshi part of his, like when he was a Punjabi early nationalist in the Swadeshi movement, self-help was a big part of that movement and agitation that he did. So industry, technical education, all those things. But yeah, I think someone else will have to.
I think I forgot that bit about the economic vision of Vivekananda. So for long, Vivekananda has been claimed as a socialist because he actually says in one place that socialism, I'm a socialist not because I think it is perfect, but because I think half a loaf of bread is better than none. But I think his views evolved, and that he comes to warn Western nations of socialism in the sense that he thinks it will lead to totalitarianism, which eventually happens with, in Soviet Union. Economically, I think it's complex, but I think he was kind of a reluctant capitalist in the sense that of course, capitalist could mean as social, democratic socialism or social democracy also, but it maybe he's definitely concerned with the welfare of the poor. So you must imagine the welfare state, but he did believe in industrialization and in free trade, and he didn't seem to. He thinks that competition is essential as a matter of life and in economic life, but he also sees a downside in that he says that the West is controlled by a group of Shylocks. But I mean, he's not using it in the Jewish sense. But what he's basically saying is that now government policy can be dictated by the business class. And in the future, however, he seems to think that just like somehow from the pre-capitalistic economic conditions, the mercantilism or whatever, from within it gave rise to capitalism. Some other economic order, maybe because of a technological revolution or something, would come around which would bring in the age of the proletariat, where there would be economic equality, but not because of a revolution, but as a natural economic progression when modes of technology shift.
So just adding on to that a little bit is, just because you mentioned socialist and capitalist, Lajpat, all of his friends abroad are actually Labour Party people. So Ramsay MacDonald, Henry Hinman, Keir, I don't know what his second name is, and so a lot of Labour politicians are people that he's interacting with in Britain and in America. And even when he comes back, he's the president, I think he's the first president of the All India Trade Union Congress. So Labour is big for him as well. So again, one of those counterintuitive positions, like how do you have this Hindu Mahasabha person who's also, socialist or, supportive of these Labour, trade union movements?
Yeah. So you guys spoke about presenting history in totality. Govind, you also spoke about this existential crisis India is facing today. You spoke about, how you, uh, this entire part about balancing history, right? Now, on one side, we have where history is twisted, even fabricated or cherry picked to serve an agenda. The intention is completely negative. Will it be really wrong if professional historians present accurate history, but a part of history where it helps to preserve the idea of India, a part of history where the intention is positive? Do you think, as professional historians, you face a dilemma between totality, history in totality, and intention of history?
That's a very good question because we do grapple with this. um, I think it depends on what your approach is. So one could be that you want to go back to history and really, find the best ideological sources for today's politics, and for you go back for those normative sources for to produce that in the present. And I think that's actually also quite legitimate. And then you can have another approach, which is that you want to present that totality and uh, understand how ideas or people or ideals also exist in practice and function in practice. And then that can also have some, you can kind of glean certain lessons from that study, that totality for the present, for an ethical, and a more accurate understanding of the present, which takes into account those complexities and those counterintuitive positions. And maybe when we miss that out, we're also we're shrinking our understanding of ideas, and also then maybe shrinking some possibilities for different kinds of politics also. But yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question, because I actually do think that both approaches are quite legitimate. Especially if you're a kind of political thought person. But as a historian, you have to kind of deal with the.
Just
Yeah.
one additional point. Is the burden always lies on this side to present a balanced view?
On,
On the professional historian side or the secular or the liberal side?
I mean, do you want to go for it, or?
I think what you're asking is a question, that ethical question that goes beyond history, right? I mean, equally applicable to journalism, for example. Not so. Do you, for a political cause, when the general rule is you don't do that, right? You never do that, and that's the same with history, that you do not involve in, you do not forget fabricating. You don't try to even bring in bias, but the point is that this kind of ethics, there's a condition of its possibility, which is democracy. What makes objective history writing possible is a certain, that you're granted the liberty to do that. What makes ethical journalism possible is that you have the liberty to do that. And ethically speaking, there's a point when you have to make a choice whether are you committed to maintaining democracy? Does it override your concern to your discipline? Because what you said, does it only fall on this side or the other side? Because fascists have always taken advantage of what they see as a weakness of. And that has happened with the way this debate has played out in journalism around Trump, because they try to stick to this model of objective reporting, and this is not the way you deal with it. So I think this is a larger choice. There's a choice that confronts people in many disciplines of knowledge when it comes to a fundamental attack on the nature of democracy itself.
But I guess the second way would be, I think, should be the chosen approach, actually, because then if you're doing too much of the selective thing, I mean, that is what the other side is also doing. So then it's becoming then you are politicizing history in a way. So you're falling into that trap, maybe, of what politicians do today. They are doing that. But I think for instance, political theorists do that really well. They go back and they look at history and the history of ideas and can glean the best practices and the best ideals and the best ideological resources. And I think that's totally legitimate.
Can you just mention something here? You must know Mark Bloch and his choice, right? I think that is very interesting, is that Mark Bloch was the famous historian, French historian, one of the analyst school, and he is in France and during the Nazi occupation, and he decides to join the resistance. And one of his colleagues says, "You're nuts. You should just sit and write history and not bother with this, because that's where your skill lies, and eventually that's going to be a bigger contribution." But he feels morally obliged to join the resistance, and he gets hanged for it. And one could argue that, I mean, maybe if he had just, probably didn't create much of a change. So I mean, I thought it was interesting in this connection.
Dr. Bhargav, Dr. Bhargav, would you like to comment on post-Lajpat Rai influence of Orthodox Hindus in the Congress Party and national movement? Because you made a very interesting point that Lajpat Rai started as a minority in a majority Muslim Punjab, then became a majority, cared for, and though his upbringing is a Arya Samaji. But later on, you have people like Swami Karpatri, Ramarajya Parishad, Gorakhpur Gita Press, and the, shall we say, closet Orthodox Hindus, not Malviyaji, but people like Kulapati and Munshiji, people like Rajendra Prasad, the Prabhudatta Brahmachari, and they came from the Gangetic belt, Prayagraj, etc. And Nehru kept pretty neat distance from no critical attack on them. So, and I think the Arya Samaji heritage stayed with Lajpat Rai. When he went to Uttarakhand, he converted the untouchables to Arya Samaj. They continued to be called Aryas after his visit in 20 sometime, and they were called Shilpkars after that. But I'm more interested in the Prabhudatta Brahmachari, Swami Karpatri, and the Gorakhpur Press.
Okay, so that's outside the scope of my research, but I would say my instinct is to say that the Congress was an umbrella organization. So you had all these different shades, Congress socialists, you know, people in the center, and then people on the right. And often I think historiography earlier would focus on, you know, the Gandhi-Nehru kind of that Congress. And of course with, you know, revisionist research has really pointed out that no, there's also this other side and this overlap. But I think what's happened now is that it's becoming conflated a little too much on this side, where people are also forgetting that there was also internal opposition. So even in Lajpat Rai's time, like a lot of people will argue that Lajpat Rai and Malviya were in the Congress was, you know, a Hindu Mahasabha, you know, a cover for Hindu Mahasabha or something, but that's just too reductive. There was a there was a Swaraj party, which was in control of the Congress, in control of, you know, the party organization, funds, and these people were, you know, sidelined by the Swaraj party, which was in control by, controlled by C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru, and that also has its implications. So I think we really need to go back to this complexity within the Congress also, with some amount of nuance, more nuance than has now. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this really interesting session, with cutting across a variety of themes on two remarkable individuals of history. So thank you again for this session. In totality, as you all have stressed, you know, thank you, Govind, for giving us different facets of Vivekananda, and also Vanya for telling us, actually, I mean, a lot of these figures are well known, but when you start reading more and more about them, you realize that, for example, I would never have thought that, you know, Swami Vivekananda smoked, even if it was a little bit at some point of time. You have a particular image of a particular person, and so please read their books. Biographies are typically big books, but as they say about big books, if you don't end up reading, you can use it to put your laptop on top of it. You can use it to weights. You know, there are lots of uses.
That's why we write.
There are lots of multiple uses of having big books that go beyond reading. But I'm sure there's going to be a lot of intellectual stimulation as well when you actually engage with them. And thank you, Pushkar, for excellent moderation, and engagement with this issue. Pushkar himself is a highly accomplished academic. Also, the way you pronounced Vivekananda was very interesting. Though I think Donald Trump has a better pronunciation. You know, he calls Vivekananda Vivekamunda, right? So that's a very famous meme which went viral, I think, when he came and gave the speech in Ahmedabad a few years back. May I invite Professor Rakesh Basant to give the mementos? And we're going to have a short 5-10 minute baitak where we're just collecting reflections from some of you who've been here for many sessions. We'd just love to hear from you in terms of what you've thought about the proceedings.